Today, we're diving into a topic I know a lot of you have been asking about, developmental disabilities. We're going to be looking at excerpts from Cheapaba, and I think it's a really interesting website because they're all about making therapy more accessible,
Mhm.
So whether you're a parent, a caregiver, or just curious about this topic, I think there's a lot of good stuff here for us to unpack.
Yeah, definitely. And what I appreciate about Cheap ABA is that they don't shy away from the nitty-gritty, you know? They really break things down in a way that's practical and easy to understand.
I like that. Practical is a good word. But before we get too far ahead of ourselves, let's start with the basics. When we say developmental disabilities, what exactly are we talking about?
Well, it's actually a broader term than a lot of people realize. Essentially, we're talking about conditions that affect a person's development, and this could be physically, it could be mentally, or even both. And the key thing here is that these conditions, they emerge early on in life, and they tend to have a lasting impact.
So not just a temporary thing, but something that really shapes a person's life journey.
Exactly, yeah. And what Cheap ABA points out, which I found interesting, is that some developmental disabilities are like super obvious right from infancy, but others might not really show up until a child is like 3 years old, maybe even older. So it's a long game in a way, understanding those developmental milestones.
Yeah, I can see how that would be so important for parents and caregivers especially. You might think everything's, moving along as expected, and then suddenly you start noticing these little differences or maybe some delays. And I guess that's where early intervention comes in, right?
100%, yeah. And to really understand the importance of early intervention, I think it's helpful to like really look at the specific ways that these disabilities can, manifest. For example, Cheap ABA, they talk about intellectual disability and they don't sugarcoat it.
Okay, so let's talk about that for a minute. Intellectual disability, it's a term I think a lot of people have heard, but I'm guessing there's like a lot more to it than meets the eye.
You got it. It's not just about like having a lower IQ, right? It's really about significant limitations in a person's cognitive abilities. Reasoning, problem solving, learning. Like imagine everyday tasks, things that you and I probably take for granted, following instructions, managing money, telling time. Those things can be so much more challenging for someone with an intellectual disability. And Cheap ABA does a good job of explaining those different levels of intellectual disability too.
Levels, so it's not a one-size-fits-all kind of thing.
Nope. Not at all.
Mhm.
You've got mild, you've got moderate, you've got severe, and then you've got profound. And each of those levels has its own set of characteristics and support needs, obviously. Like, for example, somebody with a mild intellectual disability, they might need a little extra support in school, but they can often live independently as adults. But then on the other hand, you have someone with a profound intellectual disability who might need, lifelong assistance with, like daily living activities, just as an example.
That's a really important distinction, I think. It's easy to like oversimplify these things, but cheap ABA really encourages us to, dig a little deeper. So we've got intellectual disability and those varying levels of support that might be needed. What other ways do these developmental differences kind of show up?
Well, one that comes to mind is autism spectrum disorder, or ASD, as I think a lot of people know it these days. And I have to admit, that's one where I feel like I'm still, learning more about what it actually means.
Yeah, it's definitely one of those things. It's like, we hear about it all the time, but it can be easily misunderstood. You know what I
Yeah.
mean? And I think the spectrum part is really, really important there. Cheap ABA really emphasizes how ASD can present so differently from person to person. And that's like a key takeaway, I think.
Right, because it's not like this one-size-fits-all diagnosis, right?
Right.
Exactly. And at its core, though, it really has to do with like differences in how the brain processes sensory information. The sights, the sounds, the textures, even smells, all those things we experience every day.
Yeah, I've heard that analogy before about like, it's almost like those senses are turned up, like the volume's up way higher for someone with ASD.
Exactly, exactly. And so for someone with ASD, those senses can be like super intense, and Cheap ABA even talks about how, like, imagine being in a crowded grocery store if you're a child with auditory sensitivities, for example. All those beeps and the humming and the chatter.
Oh yeah, I can't even imagine. That would be completely overwhelming.
Right. And so it's no wonder that social situations and communication can be so tricky, for some people with ASD. So that's where those unique support needs come in. It's not about like fixing someone with ASD, but it's about helping them navigate the world in a way that makes sense for them.
That makes a lot of sense. So we've talked about intellectual disability and we've talked about the spectrum of ASD. What other common developmental disabilities does cheap ABA sort of bring up?
So they spend some time on Down syndrome, which is, it's a genetic condition, right? And instead of having the usual 2 copies of chromosome 21, individuals with Down syndrome, they have 3 copies.
Okay, I think I remember learning that in like high school biology or something.
Yeah, exactly. So, a lot of people associate Down syndrome with intellectual disabilities, which, you know, that is often the case, but it's important to keep in mind those different levels of support needs that we talked about earlier.
Right, because each person with Down syndrome is going to be unique and have their own strengths and, well, and challenges too.
Exactly. And beyond intellectual abilities, Down syndrome, it can also affect muscle tone.
Yeah.
How developed those muscles are, and speech, how they develop those language skills, even their heart health. There's a lot of different factors there.
Wow, so it's a lot more complex than just one thing.
It really is. But I think the takeaway is still, early intervention can be super impactful.
Totally. So we're getting a good overview here. We've got intellectual disability with those different levels, the whole spectrum of ASD, and then Down syndrome, which is like its own whole, conversation. But cheap ABA is very clear that these are just like a few examples, right?
Yeah, definitely. I mean, we're just scratching the surface here, really. The world of developmental disabilities, it's incredibly diverse,
Hmm.
and each condition has its own set of challenges, but also its own opportunities. And while it's not always easy to pinpoint a single cause for each of these types of disabilities, Cheap ABA does a good job, I think, of unpacking some of those potential contributing factors.
Right, because I was going to ask if there's no like one cause, what are some of the things that might make it more likely that a child would develop a developmental disability?
That's a great question. And oftentimes it is a really complex combination of genetics and a person's environment. Cheap ABA talks about things like prenatal exposures, like if a mom uses drugs or alcohol during pregnancy, that can have an impact. And then there's the genetic component, obviously, things like Down syndrome or Fragile X syndrome. Those are linked to specific genes.
It's crazy how much we're learning about genetics these days.
Whoa, I know, right? It seems like every day there's a new discovery, but it's not all about those predetermined factors either, right? Cheap ABA also talks about how those early childhood experiences are so crucial.
Oh, interesting. So like what kinds of experiences are we talking about here?
Well, trauma is a big one. So, unfortunately, things like abuse or neglect or even witnessing violence, those can have a really, really deep impact on how a child's brain develops, especially in those first few years of life. And then there are things like, if a child experiences a severe infection or if they're severely malnourished, those things can also really disrupt brain development.
So it's almost like this combination of, nature and nurture. Both of those things kind of play a role in shaping, how a child develops.
100%, yeah. And that's why, early detection is so, so important because the sooner we can identify potential challenges, the sooner those kids can get the support they need. And Cheap ABA does a really nice job, I think, of laying out some of those early warning signs that, parents and caregivers should be aware of.
Okay, so let's talk about those signs for a minute. What are some things that like parents should be looking out for that might be like, maybe we need to, get some more information here. Maybe we need to talk to a doctor.
Yeah.
It's funny, I was just thinking about like when my niece was a baby, my brother and sister-in-law had like all those developmental milestone charts, and they were always like checking them and making sure she was on track. So I'm curious, what are some of the like specific things that parents and caregivers should be like paying attention to when they're thinking about developmental milestones?
Yeah, Cheap ABA actually does a really good job of breaking it down into some key areas. It's almost like imagine you're just watching a child, could be your own kid, could be a friend's kid, whatever. What are some of the things that stand out to you about their development?
Okay, so I'm trying to picture this. I mean, I guess like speech and language are like the first things that come to mind, right? Like,
Yeah.
are they babbling? Are they using words at the right age? Making sentences, all that good stuff.
Totally, yeah. And it's not just about them speaking either. It's also about can they understand what you're saying to them? Can they follow instructions? The
Okay.
two-way street, right? Communication.
Mm.
And Cheap ABA really emphasizes how important those early language skills are because they're the foundation for everything else, literacy and learning down the road.
It's like those building blocks.
Yeah,
If they're not there, it's going to be tough to like build anything on top of them.
that's a great way to put it. And then, beyond communication, Cheap ABA also talks about the importance of just watching a child's physical abilities too. So think about gross motor skills, those big movements, crawling, walking, running, jumping. Are they hitting those milestones at like roughly the ages that you would expect?
Oh, yeah. Those are always like the big ones, right? Like so many parents get excited about those first steps or, those first like wobbly attempts at kicking a ball. It's amazing to think that all of that is actually like, contributing to their development.
Right. And we can't forget fine motor skills too, those smaller, more precise movements like, are they able to hold a crayon, use scissors, button their
Yeah.
shirt, things like that.
It's crazy how those little things, they seem so small, but they actually require so much like, coordination and like dexterity.
Oh, absolutely. And then kind of switching gears a little bit, but cheap ABA also talks about like paying attention to social development. So like how does this child interact with other people? Do they make eye contact easily? Do they share toys? Do they seem to understand like those social cues?
Yeah, it's like watching them on the playground, right? Like how are they handling, taking turns sharing, all that stuff.
Exactly. Exactly. And if you notice that a child is like consistently withdrawn or they're isolated or they just don't seem interested in other kids, like that could be another sign that, maybe it's worth like getting some more information.
Yeah, it's almost like trusting your gut as a parent or caregiver,
Yeah.
right? Like if something just feels a little off or if your intuition is telling you, this isn't quite right, it's probably a good idea to, talk to a professional.
Yeah, totally. And, while it's definitely important not to like overreact to every little, quirk that your kid has, Cheap ABA also does say like be mindful of any behaviors that are concerning. So, things like are they having these like extreme tantrums? Are they aggressive?
Yeah.
Any kind of like, self-harming behaviors, those are all red flags and they really do warrant like immediate attention.
Yeah, it's finding that balance between like observing and knowing when to like actually step in. But early intervention, it really can make such a big difference.
It really, really can. Like the earlier that a developmental disability is identified and, addressed, the better the outcomes for that child. It's common sense when you think about it. Early intervention means, access to therapies, maybe they need some specialized learning strategies, and just like that whole support system can make it so much more likely that they're going to thrive.
So let's say a parent, is listening to this and they're thinking, okay, I'm like starting to see some of these things in my child. What are their next steps? What should they do?
Well, Cheap ABA is really big on this, and I agree with them. The first step, and the most important step, is actually the simplest. Talk to your child's doctor. Like, they're a great resource, right? They can kind of assess the situation, maybe do some tests, and if they think it's necessary, they can refer you to some specialists. It's all about, like, just taking that first step and being your child's advocate.
Yeah, the advocacy piece is so huge, especially when you're like navigating, all these diagnoses and therapies. It can be really overwhelming.
For sure. And, while getting the right support is like super important, Cheap ABA also reminds us about like the power of those everyday interactions, like just talking to your child, singing with them, reading to them, all those little things, they really do add up and they make a big difference.
I love that. It's like, even amidst all of this, the challenges, the diagnoses, all that stuff, the power of just like loving your kid and connecting with them. That's like, it goes a long way.
100%. And that actually reminds me, one of the things that I really liked about Cheap ABA was their focus on affordability. They're really trying to make these resources accessible to everyone. And I think that's a really important part of this conversation.
Yeah, for sure. Access to these services, it shouldn't depend on like how much money your family has. You know what I mean?
Mhm. Exactly. And so as we kind of wrap up here, like the big question I want to leave people with is this. How can we as a society do a better job of creating a more supportive environment for people with developmental disabilities and their families? And I think that's something that, requires all of us to like think about it and take action.
I love that. That's such a great question to leave people with. And, we covered so much today from like the basics of what developmental disabilities are to like how to recognize those early signs to the importance of early intervention and so much more. But I think more than anything, I just hope that our listeners feel like, a little more empowered to get support if they need it and to advocate for themselves and their kids.
Yeah, absolutely. It's all about, knowledge and awareness and just like a whole lot of compassion.
That's a beautiful way to put it. And on that note, I think that's a wrap on our deep dive into the world of developmental disabilities. A huge, huge thank you to you for sharing all of your insights and to all of our listeners for like coming on this journey with us. Until next time, stay curious.